My name is Butch Bateman. I'm on the board of directors of the Heritage Museum of Montgomery County. Today is Wednesday, August the 29th. We're still in an extreme drought and heat wave here in Montgomery County. I have the pleasure today to introduce Mr. Bob Peel, who resides in Montgomery. He's a longtime resident, fourth generation of Montgomery County, and we're going to talk today with Mr. Peel about the way life used to be many years ago when Conroe and Montgomery in the county was a much smaller place. Mr. Peel, thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Let me start this by correcting you on the date.
Okay.
Today is the 28th of September.
Did I say the 29th?
Of August. So we get off on the right date. Anyway. Okay. I'm not real sure what you want to hear. I'll talk about my youth. I was born in Montgomery.
Okay.
Born and raised in this town at that hospital over there across the tracks. I think it's part of the city government or county or something now. I'm not sure what it is.
The hospital in Montgomery.
In Conroe there.
In Conroe.
Born in Conroe.
On First Street.
Yeah, Montgomery never had a hospital.
Yeah.
And grew up, right in the town. Went to school there, till I went away to San Marcos Academy. Daddy shipped me off up there. Some things I'm proud of going to San Marcos and enjoyed it, but historical things, some of you don't like the reasons to come out.
I had some friends that went up to San Marcos and other places.
But it was a good school, it really was.
What year were you born in?
Born in 1939.
1939?
I didn't know my grandfather on Daddy's side. I knew him on my mother's side. But I knew my grandmother. Grandma passed away, and matter of fact, Lester Peel passed away, my grandfather, the year I was born in 39. So I have no recollection of him. Yeah. But I knew Daddy's mother, and I knew her. She died in 1975. Yeah. And my history goes back through her side, back to Nat Davis. He was my great-great-grandfather, Nat Hort Davis. W.B. Wood was my great-grandfather on Daddy's mother's side. Daddy died in 96, and everybody knew my father. I'm one of 3 children. I have 2 sisters. None of them live in Montgomery. Mm-hmm. They don't. One of them has a child that's there in town. Matter of fact, he was mayor for a period of time.
So the three children, were they close to you? Were they?
Well, we're 3 years apart in age, yes.
And when you were a young man growing up, where did you live in Montgomery?
We lived on the hill by the school. Actually, it's the only school in town. Well, there was one on the north side of town. Back then, they had segregation.
That's right.
And but it was the only school in town. They had grades 1 through 12 right there. And they graduated classes of, 8, 9, sometimes 7 or 8, 9, somewhere in that neighborhood.
All the classes were in one building? One
building, yeah. Okay. Grades 1 through 12. And they had an elementary school when I went to the first grade in elementary school, which was at the bottom of the hill, but it burned down that year. I didn't have a thing to do with it, but it burned down that year. Okay. And so we all went up to the big school up there. Didn't make it any bigger. They just put you up there and made room for you.
So you remember what it was like going to class as a young boy?
Certainly. I didn't have to ride a bus or anything. I wasn't 200 feet from school. Okay. And that's another story I can tell you someday. I just walked to class. I can remember most of my teachers. Yeah. Most of my younger teachers. There were some good ladies. Ms. Wilcox taught me in the first grade. I remember Ms. Brogdon.
Now, at this particular time, when you were in, so to speak, elementary school, you had electricity?
Oh, sure. I had electricity all my life. I don't remember not having electricity in Montgomery.
Okay. You didn't have any air conditioning?
Well, when I got to be about 15, it did.
Right. But the early years...
Oh, no. There was just big fan, open the windows.
That's right. Open the windows.
Attic fan. Daddy had an attic fan in the house. It was bad news till the squirrels started getting in the attic, and then you had problems with it.
Yeah. For those viewers that don't know what an attic fan is, it's a device that goes in the ceiling, and you turn it on, and it sucks the wind through the windows. And that's how we stayed cool
That was it.
people in the 50s and 60s before the invention of air conditioning.
We got around on horseback in my youth. I started riding a horse. I can't remember not riding a horse. And Daddy had a little, about a half Shetland horse that I grew up riding. And then he got me a little bigger horse that, these are just stories. The horse was named Nip, and he was named that for a purpose, because he would bite me, or anyone that would try to get on him. He would turn his head and take a bite out of him, and that hurts. You learn to pop him good before you get on him. But we rode everywhere in town. That was all over town.
And how big at that era, how big was the city of Montgomery?
The population was about 400, and it's not a whole lot more than that now. The town hasn't grown a lot. It's going to, and it's grown some. I think it's around 600 now. I'm not sure. But it's going to expand. Everybody knows that. It's just we get out of this now.
Quite a small city limits area.
Well, it was, 2 miles square.
Okay.
Actually, back then it was 1 mile square, and then they decided to make it 2 miles square. 1 mile from the center of town being the old community building, 1 mile in every direction. And it encompassed quite a few in the school district. That was a different deal. It went all the way to, the crossroads up there. What is that, Mount Moriah?
Right.
And Dobbin, that side of Dobbin. Took in a good school district, big school. That school burned down after I graduated. Again, I had nothing to do with it. But it burned down.
Who did?
I have no idea. Don't want to know. That's one of those things you want to forget.
You graduated what year, Bob?
I graduated in '57
57.
from school in
So
San Marcos Academy.
A one-room schoolhouse the whole time?
No, it had multiple rooms. It was just one school,
building?
one building. And it was a U-shaped building with an auditorium in the middle of it. And the rest of it was classes all around the U's.
So at some point they installed air conditioning?
Not in my time there. When I was there was never air conditioning in the school. And I don't think they had until that school burned down. I don't recall them ever putting air conditioning in it. And it burned in the, I'm thinking 80s, early 80s, maybe late 70s, somewhere in that period.
So in your class, do you remember how many people graduated?
Oh, there were probably 11 or 12 in my class from Montgomery, but I didn't graduate with that class.
Do you still see any of them? Any of them around?
Once in a while I do. Most of them are gone now, or moved on to other places. Once I've tried to find a couple of them that I was friends with, and I can't find them. And of course, all the teachers, all of them are gone now.
Sure.
Miss Dora Brogdon, I remember her very well. She had a habit of grab you by your ear. That was her punishment, to grab you by your ear. And as kids, I guess all kids do that, we had, you'd catch these black bees, bumblebees with a white head, and they had no stinger. I don't know if kids aren't aware of that today. I've showed it to my grandchildren, but you catch them in your hand, they can't sting you. They just got to have that white spot in the head, though. That's others will sting you and hurt you. These are boring bees, those wood boring bees.
Right.
And we'd tie little threads on them and just tie them to a pocket, button or something. Hell, they'd fly around all day, just flying above your head, light on your shoulder. Miss Dora frowned on that big time.
I can only imagine. I can't recall the kids in Colorado schools doing that.
Oh, we had to look for things in Montgomery. I think I lettered in marbles 2 or 3 years in Montgomery. Marbles and washers, that was a big deal for youngsters.
That's right. Marbles, that's where you get down, you flip a marble in the center.
You shoot for holes. No, we didn't play, that's gambling. We played for holes. You'd make an L with holes, and the first one to rope the holes and get back the toy, you were the winner then.
And describe for people that are watching this what a game of washers is.
Well, you have 3 washers, and you're throwing again at a hole, and you count by ringers, count 5. No, ringers are 3. Closest 2 is 1 point. Right. Played a game of 21. Right. You have to win by 2, just like most games. If you're tied at 21, you go on. And they started football in Montgomery in 1956, 55, I think. I was on the first football team ever played in Montgomery. Matter of fact, I quarterbacked the team. We had a
12-man ball?
11-man football.
11-man.
Yeah, we had 13 people come out for football, so you pretty well made the team if you showed up. And we didn't win a game that year, but we played Willis, and Magnolia, and a couple of schools out of Houston. I can't remember. I remember the first touchdown we ever made. You would have thought we won the game. You know, it was about the third game of the year. The first game we played, our jerseys hadn't come in yet. And they had those practice white jerseys. Yep. They were all nasty and dirty. You'd take them home and wash them. We had to bring them to school that morning. They painted numbers on them with shoe polish. And that was our first game we ever played, had those jerseys on.
You remember who you played? I
don't remember. I can't remember. Montgomery didn't have a field, so they had two home games that year. So we just made a field out of Daddy's pasture next door. He was next door to school there. They just mowed it real short and drew the lime lines on it, and you had to play in the afternoon. You couldn't play at night. And the game was running a little long, and people pulled up with their automobiles and turned their lights on. And we finished about the last 4 minutes of the game with car lights. And that was it. So, and then the next year they started putting up some lights in that same field. But that was a long time ago. We enjoyed it.
I can imagine.
Enjoyed everything back then.
Give us a little bit of a description of what, in your youth and junior high and high school, what was downtown, what was Montgomery like? What kind of stores, what was there?
Well, we didn't have there was no cafe in town. If you wanted a sandwich, you went to Mr. Huff's, and they'd make you a sandwich out of bologna and cheese and 2 pieces of bread, hand it to you over the counter. My grandmother lived in town right where O'Reilly's Hardware is today. Okay. And that's, traffic through Montgomery was little or nothing back then. And I remember my grandmother, she wanted Daddy to build a cafe in Montgomery. Boy, she just wanted give her a place to go. She lived by herself, and she didn't have anywhere place to go, and she'd have somebody come do her breakfast or something, but then she had to scrounge around and get somebody to cook her a meal, or somebody to invite her up and eat. And I can hear her hollering at Daddy now, TJ, I sat on my porch all day today, and I counted 27 cars came by there. Now, that's enough for a cafe in this town. 27 cars. She wouldn't sit all day. She'd sit out there 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah, you count cars?
Count 27 cars.
Well, did your father ever build a cafe for
No,
you?
he wasn't in the cafe building. If you ever knew my dad, you know he wasn't going to build a cafe.
I vaguely remember it from my time. So here in the 50s, you had a general store. Was there a bank?
I had several general stores. No, the bank failed in 1920. Okay. Went under in 1920. The building's still there.
Exactly.
It's a winery, I think, today.
Looks like a bank.
Yeah, it still looks like a bank.
Look at it, you say that's an old bank.
Sure. It's you've got on that bank on First State Bank, whatever it is, on the front of it. Right. Hadn't changed a bit there. I've got a store right next to it, which is the site of my great-grandfather's store. W.B. Wood had a store there, and Lester Peel had one across the street from it, which is now Logan's over there.
What was the store? What was the early store that Mr. Peel had?
It was a general merchandise and feed, and then Lester, Pet Peel ran it for a few years, and that's another story with Pet. But then he
was he your uncle?
He was my great uncle. Yes,
great uncle?
He was actually my great uncle. He was Lester Peel's brother, and then he didn't want to do it anymore. And then Buzzy Peel, who was my uncle, took it over, and he did it for a little. That was my first job working for Buzzy Peel, that store. And it lasted about 4 hours. That was about it. They had
You decided you didn't want to be a storekeeper?
Well, there was an old truck pulled up out back and had a load of feed on it. Back then, they were 100-pound bags. They weren't in these 50-pound bags you buy today. And Buzzy rolled me back there with a dolly, and he said, we're going to unload this truck. I said, fine. And we both threw sacks on the dolly, the first one, and we rolled it up front. And he said, we're stacked over here. And he threw off a couple, and I threw a couple off. And he said, okay, I'll see you later. And he went up to the front of the store and sat down at a little table he had there talking to some men, drinking coffee. And I unloaded the entire truck. And I got tired of it, and I quit. I said, I'm not going to do this. I said, you're supposed to be working too. So I just went up and told him I wanted my money. I quit. So
that was it.
He chuckled.
The Peels had a general merchandise store, and the great uncle, there were 2 stores owned by the Peels.
They competed against each other, as a matter of fact. And then Lester Peel ended up marrying W.B. Wood's daughter. is the way the families got intertwined.
Okay. So you're 18 years old, you just graduated from high school, and you're headed where?
Oh, I come back to Montgomery, and I worked a bunch of summers for, back then, it was Humble Oil and Refining, I think Exxon today. But
That's right.
in the oil field, doing survey work or just general jobs. Daddy knew
Was this the
some.
field around Montgomery? Was this the
It
Conroe
was
field?
different areas. So I worked up around Huntsville for a while, and
Yep.
then worked down at towards Liberty, that area, different areas. He knew somebody with Exxon or Humble, and got me a job every year. And
So were you actually working on the rigs, or?
no, I never did work on rig. I worked on survey crews. A couple of years I did pulled a chain, which is
Right.
measurement
Yep.
device, and I worked on a seismic crew one year. I never did set the blast off, but I would help do the holes and set up the seismic stuff, and they'd send me off and do their other stuff. It was interesting. I don't think I learned a whole lot.
Stomping around out in the country,
I'm sorry.
walking around out in the
Oh yeah,
country.
you just I carried the machete and cut the clearance for most of them. They'd walk behind me, never go in front of me. So
Now, you mentioned earlier that your father had a property right next to the school.
that's where I was born and raised. Right, that's where I was raised, right in that house. It's still in the family. My Sarah has it now, and her son lives there.
Okay.
He was Travis Mabry is his name.
So he would be the third generation Peel to live in the house? Second?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Because Daddy died, and Sarah Ann never lived there, but she grew up there, and I did too.
Okay.
And now he's had it, yes. My mother, who is not her mother, we're half sisters. My mother's still alive. My mother is still 97 years old, still kicking. And gives me a bad time once in a while too.
That's funny. That's the same term that my 95-year-old father uses. I'm still kicking.
Is he still around?
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
Mark's still there.
That's great. Mama's
So
doing
any
good.
changes now here in the early 60s, I guess? Montgomery's still pretty small.
Yeah, the town hadn't changed in years. They put a red light in it
Yeah.
in, I'm going to say, the mid 50s to late 50s, somewhere in there. There used to be a straight shot through Montgomery. There was a stop sign on 149, but 105, hang on, because you could go right on through town. Never slow down. There was a big old bodark tree there to slow people down, because it'd drop its crop there in the highway and hung out over 105.
So what happened to the bodock tree?
They took it down about 1970. And it really was a hazard, because then they widened the street and they couldn't do anything with it. So they took the tree out. It was huge. It was almost big as this table, I promise you. Just
I
a
think I recall it.
huge tree. You couldn't miss it.
So all during this time as a young man, Montgomery basically is a ranching where the crops grow?
Well, we had ranching. They had timber industry.
Yeah.
I was big in my youth, which was the pulpwood industry.
They're cutting pine trees?
They're whacking up. They did away with all the big timber.
Right.
And they had the railroad that backed into Montgomery, that was an interesting deal. I rode that a few times, but
You say back then?
they backed in. Montgomery was a dead end to the railroad. And the train would be from Navasota to Conroe, and it'd come around, it'd go by and then back in the siding,
Okay.
come into the depot there, and they would load up, back the cars and leave them. They'd load them up with the pulpwood, and they had a passenger train that came in there, no windows or anything in it, just, you get in it and ride to Navasota if you wanted to, or Conroe.
Interesting. So the landscape of Montgomery as a young man, as a boy, was it mostly all woods?
The landscape of the town, if you drove through it today, is about the same as it was in my youth.
But I mean, all the ranches, was most of those the pastures already cut off?
Pasture, most of them are pastures. They did away with the big timber industry years ago. The pulpwood that came from outlying areas up towards Richards and different directions. Dobbin, that area had some timber. North of Montgomery had some timber, but it was primarily cattle.
Yeah.
The old cotton gins that shut down years before.
Any sawmills in Montgomery?
Had several little sawmills, nothing big. A couple of them over at Dobbin, that area. Had a couple of dairies over in Dobbin.
Interesting.
Had the last one, I think, shut down around in the late, mid-'80s somewhere. Herzog, I can't remember what year he shut down. It was in the '80s, so it's when he closed it up.
Yeah, we've seen
But
a lot of businesses open up in our era.
This didn't, well, you know, the big companies run dairy business now. Big companies do grain companies, and nobody owned that kind of land around Montgomery that you could farm that much, or, you know, Daddy had some acreage, but, you know, if you don't own the property today, you can't make a living with cattle. It'd starve you to death.
We talk about the different generations in your family. We obviously, at least you and I and the people in this room know, your father was Mr. T.J. Peel.
Yes, that's right.
That's right.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about growing up, and how did your family get into the ranching part of it, and own property, and when did your dad decide to get into politics?
I'm not sure when he decided to get into it. He got into it in, I guess, the 40s, mid-40s, somewhere in there after the war, maybe during the war, I'm not sure.
Was he always a commissioner?
He was commissioner. He didn't want to be anything else.
Yeah. His precinct took up most of...
Willis, actually, no, it wasn't Willis. It's about what it is today. They split it up, made it a little bit smaller.
Yeah.
When they put in another precinct, but it's about what it is today.
Okay.
Took out, you know, towards the lake, all that was part of Montgomery.
So
Which wasn't any lake.
Richards, up to the county line and up to Richards.
Everything west, Dobbin, everything over there.
Everything west of there.
Over towards Magnolia, not Magnolia. They all knew one another, all the commissioners. And they used to be good friends, matter of fact.
Explain to our guests that are watching this what a county commissioner does in Texas.
Their purpose then was, and is today, road commissioners. They were referred to as road commissioners,
Right.
but they also delegate uses of your tax dollar as far as maintenance for the county and things that's to be spent on. But primarily roads and bridges and streets, and if you're in an unincorporated town, which Richards is, they're responsible for those. Dobbin, they're responsible for those. Montgomery used to be, and then Montgomery Incorporated. Nobody can pinpoint when, it just seems to have happened. And
So your family property was abutted right up next to the city limits?
no, not Dad's. The city was outside of his property. That part of it was primarily in the city.
Okay.
Now the place that's Buffalo Springs now, about 60% of it was out of the city.
Okay.
Now they have since brought it into the city.
Okay.
The people requested. When Dad passed away, he left his main holding, which was that Bodark Ranch, to 9 different people. You can't leave a sunset to 9 people. You can't split it up, so you have to sell it. And it became my duty and my sad duty to sell this place. I didn't want to, but you have to.
Well, as we talk about the way things were, you're going to have to explain to guests, what's a Bodark tree, Bob?
A lot of people in this area know it as a horse apple.
That's right.
And
Big.
that's right. And they're sticky to your hands, and you know nothing will eat it except a horse and a squirrel. Now, squirrels will eat them, and horses don't always like them.
Yeah.
If you cut them open, a horse will certainly eat it. But the word bod, it's B-O-I-S-D-A-R-C, 3 different words there. Bodark.
Bodega.
It means boards of the ark. Supposedly this was the wood that was used on the ark, but I'm not sure that's how true that story is. There's another story, it was used by Indians to make their bows, but I don't think that's true either because it's so hard. When it's tempered or years, age, it's just hard as a rock. They make great fence posts.
Yep. I remember trying to cut some of them down.
You couldn't drive a nail in one if it's been out. You know, if it's been harvested 10 years, you couldn't put a nail in it.
But in our era now, you see very few of those.
Not too many. Not too many.
Yeah, they've mostly been eradicated.
People don't like the tree,
Yeah.
and they don't realize there's a male and female tree, and the female produces the apple, and the male tree has the thorns. We'll get rid of the male. You know, keep one male, you get all these female trees, they'll pollinate, everything works out. But they don't like those thorns, and they are a horrible thorn.
Yeah,
They'll take your lunch. They'll hurt you.
So your dad got into politics and became a county commissioner. How long was he a county commissioner?
I think 16 years. I believe it was 16 or 16 years, I believe. He, 16 or 18 years, I'm not sure. But he had been in the cattle business all my life. I just remember raising and working those old Bremer cows from the time I was 6 or 7 years old. I remember that. I remember different horses, some good ones. I remember people around town, the Rampy family.
Right.
Mr. Rampy had a son named Tyrone that was into roping, and Mr. Rampy fixed him up. He had a fine horse, a cutting horse, a good roping horse, and a good-looking saddle and everything. I got those old hand-me-downs from Daddy. He didn't believe in all that stuff. But Tyrone was a good man, too. That was a tragedy. That family went through a lot of tragedy. They really did. Lost their son and 2 sons. And it was just a sad situation there for a number of years. But Daddy had those Zebu. He got into Zebu cattle later in his life, and he learned to love them. And he just
What's a Zebu cattle?
it's a type of Bremer,
Okay.
but they're a more sturdy animal and they're bigger than the gray Bremer is the most common one in this area. And they come from south. Actually, they came up from South America. And to me, they were always, I didn't like them, but we had a few arguments about that, but they were his cows, they weren't mine.
That's right.
So I helped him take care of them.
So as county commissioner, I think I told you, we interviewed Joe Corley. And he was quite complimentary because where he lived in Richards, it was your father that got him a road.
Right.
Because everything in that area at the time in Montgomery County was dirt, rutted roads.
Oh, Joe was a good man. He's also a fox hunter, or was. I'm not sure he still does. Daddy was a fox hunter.
There were foxes in your area up there around?
They were in the National Forest, and they would go up there and cast hounds. And Mr. Corley, Joe's daddy, was a hunter. And matter of fact, I think it was Mr. Corley and Daddy are the ones that brought the gray fox to Montgomery. They imported them. We have a red fox here that's natural, and the grays have so much more stamina. And they brought them in, but Lord, I can remember them chasing those foxes. I never did get into that. They go sit around a fire and name all the dogs. There's old Lip hollering. You're going to hear a trigger open up. Yep, there he is. There he comes. Hey, one night I had an excitement at fox hunting with my dad, and we were sitting just inside the fence on that place on 1097, which is now, what is that bend out there?
Bentwater?
Bentwater, yeah, Bentwater. And the gate going into the place, part of that was Dad's place, belonged to Daddy and Willie Weisinger were the major landholders. And the gate was right by the fire station there. And the gate's still there. But we were maybe 200 feet inside of it. And they built a fire in the middle of the road, and they could hear the dogs. You can hear them for half a mile. And they're naming them, and they're having a little libation. There were 4 or 5 men around there. And they'd take me along. I'd be the dog retriever. When they went home, I'd stay around and pick up the dogs, bring them home in the trailer. And we were sitting around this fire, and there was about 6 or 7 men, and they were getting closer. The hounds, there were probably 8 or 9 dogs running, and they were chasing the fox, getting closer and closer. And somebody said, well, I think they're coming up the damn road. And sure enough, about 150, 200 feet up the road, there was a curve, and around it, you could just firelights is all you could see. We didn't have spotlights or anything. We could see a fox that came around the corner and went over the fire, bounded, jumped over the fire. And everybody's jumping back and falling back, and about the time you get away from the fire, here's 9 dogs ran right through it. And everybody got a kick out of that. I'll never forget that.
I can imagine.
They went right on across 1097 chasing that fox.
So some of your dad's property in the ranch was now where Bentwater, where Lake Conroe is?
Yes.
So part of it was taken up by the lake?
Quite a bit of it, yes.
Really?
Yes, quite
So
a bit.
that-
Split it, as a matter of fact. He had a little over off Walden Road. There's a house. You ever go down Walden Road?
Sure.
You know where Del Lago is?
Yes, sir.
Across the street from it, you ever noticed a little old house sitting out there?
I've probably have. I used to have a couple of boats out there.
Just look across the street, the house is still there. There's a huge red barn and there's that little shack that's there. That's the house my dad and my mother lived in when they first got married.
Oh,
That little house, and it's still there.
so the property owners, that's no longer part of the family.
Oh no, we had to sell all that. Daddy sold that, as a matter of fact. He sold all that Bentwater property in his lifetime.
Okay.
And
So that, whoever owns that property has kept the old house.
yeah, it's still there.
Interesting.
They haven't improved it any.
Yeah.
And I tried to get it from them at one time, and I had an inspector go up, and it couldn't be moved because the termites had eaten all the foundation out.
Ah, that's too bad.
The man was going to let me have it if I preserved it. He was good about that.
Interesting. Well, we interviewed Floyd Baker some months ago, the house mover. So he moved a lot more houses than
I
ever
bet he
used.
did. I know Mr. Becker. He's moved a couple for me.
Yeah. So in this area now in the 60s, and where your dad's still alive, when somebody got sick, they had to come into Conroe. Do you have any doctors in Montgomery?
No, not that lived in town. He had to go out of town. Daddy had a stroke in 70. See, when he died in 96, no, it was 82, he had a stroke. And it just debilitated him. He was bedridden for the rest of his life. But he tried to stay in the business, and it's hard to get out of it, once you're in it. And he called on me to come up and help him with his stuff. And I lived in Crosby at the time. I'd moved out of Montgomery. And he just asked me if I'd come up and help him, and we moved back in 88 is when I moved back. Lived in a little ranch house till we decided what we were going to do, if I was going to stay or not. And we ended up buying that old Methodist parsonage in Montgomery.
Oh, I know it.
And sunk a bunch of money into that.
Join the crowd.
And then sold it. I bought a place outside of my Sissy Bowere's old place. You know where that is out of Montgomery? We bought that place out of there and lived out.
Go ahead.
It's just a little acreage, and I had some cattle, and I was trying to stay in the business. My son lives down on Lake Creek on the place, and he's got a few old cows, and just something for the kids to look at, really. I had a granddaughter that was in the show cattle, and I kept cattle just to keep her in calves to show.
Tell us about your family.
My family, I have a son, Chris. I have a daughter, Denise. She's the oldest. She lives in Houston. She has a daughter that's at Texas Tech University. She has an older son that's 24, I think now, 25, but she lives in California, and he's in the movie business. Don't ask me what he does, because I really don't know, but he's in the movie business. My younger daughter, Deborah, she lives in Montgomery in the house that was built by W.B. Wood in 1897. It was left to me by Valda Wood. And my daughter moved into it. She wanted to live there. And she's got a daughter that's a sophomore at A&M. Okay. She's got a son that's a senior at A&M, graduates this year. Chris, my son, has two boys, and they are Little League baseball players, 9 and 7 are their ages. So I got to run the whole gamut there, 7 to 24.
7 to 24. So you're still out watching the Little League games.
I got to go Saturday to the opening games. Yep.
I'll see you there.
So tell
us, the distance between Montgomery and Conroe is 20-something miles?
No, it's about 15, but that's on the new highway. That wasn't there when I was growing up.
How did you used to get from Montgomery to Conroe?
Well, it's 2854 is the highway.
We call that now the old Montgomery Highway.
That's exactly what it was. But it did a little twisting and turning. It wasn't a straight shot.
Right.
My grandmother used to, actually that was the only way. When it flooded, the bridge would flood. The old bridge is still there.
They're on the same setup?
Yeah, and it would flood real easy, real quick. And you just either stayed in Conroe or you walked across the railroad track. Railroad track was a lot higher. And I recall my grandmother, and this was about 1965, somewhere in there, calling Daddy and telling him to get her home. She was in Conroe, had been shopping, and she wanted to come home. And he was telling her, Mama, I can't, I don't have a boat. She's like, would you do what we can? And he talked her into walking across that railroad thing. And I heard about that the rest of her life. Oh my God, TJ made me do it.
She was a little upset, wasn't she?
Oh, she was upset as she could be. That scared her to death walking across that thing.
Oh,
like
I can imagine. So he picked her up on the other side.
Picked her up on the Montgomery side.
So
Brought
that
her home.
area where that old bridge is, all that flooded.
Oh yeah, that park, everything used to be would flood underwater. It used to be horrible.
Yeah,
But you couldn't help it. You just didn't go to Conroe.
that's it. Because
stayed
that was
in
really the only way. There was no,
When you back road, you go to Houston, come
unless
around,
you go to Navasota
or Huntsville,
or Huntsville
Come
and
around.
come down. That was it.
or you go to Willis. That back road to Willis, 1097's been there for years. Yeah.
Right.
But that road direct to Conroe wasn't there. You couldn't do it.
Interesting. So here your father's still working. Was he still a commissioner when he sold the property when the lake came in?
No, he was not. He sold the property in the, I guess, early 70s, but they didn't develop it. And he just stayed in the cattle business, tried to improve his herd a little bit. Bought him a couple of good horses. He loved a good horse. And he had well, that's another story. I know you want to follow this, okay?
No. We'll talk about the history of Montgomery County. So you can talk about whatever you'd like to, Bob.
He had a horse that I went down to South Texas with him to get. And he named the horse Martinez because he came off some ranch down there. I can't remember the name of the ranch, but it's a big ranch, beautiful horse, big stud horse. And across the road from the house there, property that belongs, Daddy had it leased, he didn't own it, and to Richard Randall, who it belongs to. And that's kinfolks, and Daddy leased the property from him, had a few cows on it. And there was a bull over there, broke his horn off. And somehow in a tree, got his head caught in it and broke one of his horns off. Well, that's got to hurt. It's just got to be painful as it could be. And he was fighting and anything you got around him. And myself and my dad and Rich Allen, who's a black man that lived in Montgomery, and Leon Lane, who's a man from over at Dacus, went over there horseback to get the bull. And Dad was riding that big stud horse. And I was riding on a horse named Tony. And we got 3 ropes on him, and we had him between us. And I was probably 14 at the time, around 14 years old. Wasn't any older than that. And we got him, the pens were right up near where the school barn is in Montgomery now, and right in that corner. And we got the bull almost to the pens, and he started hitting the ends of the rope and doing this and that. And he broke Daddy's rope, and so it was myself and Rich holding the bull. Leon didn't have a rope on him. He was trying to get one on him. And he hit the end of Rich's, and Rich was holding his daly with his hand. Well, the rope started burning his hand. He turned it loose. So it's me and the bull, and that was it. And that bull turned, and I'm backing, the horse was backing up good, and he turned and came to me. It all seemed, I can remember it, but it all happened so fast. It seemed like it was going on 20 minutes, but it wasn't. Running straight at me. And I was getting off the horse. I mean, I knew something was fixing to happen bad, and I didn't want to be a part of it. But I didn't quite make it off. He put that single horn up in the brisket of that horse, and he was dead before he hit the ground. And I hit the ground running. And the bull was chasing me, dragging a dead horse. My daly was tight, and I had it locked in, and he couldn't get rid of him. He had the horse. He was tied to the horse. And Daddy said, "I'll be right back." And he said, "Go, boy, go." And I went up a tree, and he went to the house and got a rifle and came back and shot that bull. I remember that. But he was going to try to save him, and doctor him. That's back when the screw worms were so bad in Montgomery County. It was a horrible thing that cattle got when they get infected so bad, and they would kill them and just eat them up.
Wow. And
you had to doctor for them. Anytime they had a bloody wound or any kind of wound, you had to doctor them. That's been a long time ago. I hadn't thought about that in years.
Well, that's a good story. Tell us a little bit what you remember when your dad was a commissioner. Everybody, when you talk about your father, he was really a character.
I guess the main thing I remember is Daddy was he was a staunch Democrat to start with, but
the whole county was at that.
it was. It's very much Democrat. If you weren't a Democrat, you weren't elected.
That's right.
And he would get phone calls at night, at all hours of the night, and somebody needing his help. They either needed to get in the hospital or they needed to get out of jail. Somehow they needed his help. And this, I mean, it would be, I'm not saying every day, but it would be often. It would be 2 or 3 times a week he would get these phone calls. And he might disappear, come back an hour or two. And if it was somebody that needed help, Daddy would help them. If they needed to get in the hospital, he got them in the hospital. There wasn't any Medicare or any of that back then. It was, I'm not sure how he did it or what he did, but he would get them taken care of. And if they deserved to get out of jail, he'd help them there, but not that night. He'd go the next day and do that. Got me out of jail one night. We loaded up there was a group of kids and some Conroes, some of the bad Conroe guys, you know. Chuck Mears, George Billingsley, Roddy Gorman, several guys I ran around with. One boy, I can't remember his name, his dad had the Crichton Theater. Can't remember, Buck Horton. We put some garbage in a police car one night. They caught us doing it. And they made us clean the car up real quick, you know. And it was just old kitchen garbage. It wasn't clean garbage at all. It wasn't easy to clean it up. And they took us to jail and put us in the jail and called parents. Well, most of them, as a matter of fact, all of them, my daddy came down that night and got them out. Daddy said, just leave him there. I'll be there in the morning. And he shows up the next morning. He had a man. You remember, this gentleman will remember it, the old cameras with the lights that stuck out to the side with the movie cameras. He's in there taking pictures, and Daddy, I could hear him talking. Now, this is my boy.
My boy in jail.
Taking pictures of him. Aren't we proud of him? He was and he would show that every Christmas. He'd come out with that film and show it to everybody. It got to be a joke in the family.
How old were you when that happened?
I was probably 15.
Oh, okay.
Just a kid. You know, they weren't putting me in jail. They were just wanted the parents to correct you on it.
Yeah. We've had several people in this interview process talk about the importance when your dad was the commissioner of transportation. That especially in the rural areas, they could not get around until that grader came around. And they saw that grader coming.
Well,
Daddy, the road was going to get fixed.
He did a good job, I'll say that.
And eventually they got some bond money passed.
But he did it politically, and I can tell you stories on that all day long, but he had his way of doing things. Yeah. There was a gentleman over, I won't mention names, but there was a gentleman that never voted for Dad over in Dobbin, and lived down at Mount Moriah Road. And Dad was over there working on the back roads, and he graded up his driveway all the way to his house. He lived back off the road, and he was hauling in some gravel to put around his culverts and slicking it up, made it look so good. And he came down and told Dad, he said, TJ, I don't care what you do, you know I'm not going to vote for you. He said, I know that, but your neighbors don't know it. I thought that was good. He told me one year, Daddy was a jokester, he told me to put out his campaign signs. He said, go up there and put them in the cemetery. He said, we got more people voting up there than we have in the town.
That was fairly common.
It was, very much so.
When they had elections, remember going to the courthouse where the elections were held?
Sure. I remember everybody had to register to vote.
Yeah.
I remember in the Montgomery, this was in my youth, there was a store called S.I. Huff's, 149 and 105. It's now an auction barn or something in there. He and his wife, and he was the only registered Republican in Montgomery. There was one registered Republican. So they had to send 2 people over for him to vote. You know, they have Democrats sitting here, Republicans here. And everybody would go over to the Democrat table and vote. And as soon as that registered Republican voted, they went home. Mr. Huff would make them wait till 5:30, and he'd leave his store and go up there and vote. And his wife would go right behind him. She'd vote at the Democrat table, cancel his vote. But he'd keep them waiting all day. S.I. Huff.
So you've been back in Montgomery since '88?
I came back in '88. I was gone for about 15 years. And just decided, Daddy called and asked me, and I just decided to come back.
Right. So now, between '88 and here we are, I'll get the year right, it's the year 2011. You've seen quite a few changes.
Well, it has. The big change was when we had to sell Daddy's property, sell his ranch. That opened up for the subdivision, but we sold it to a good man.
Yep.
He's kept his word on what he said he was going to do.
That's important.
And it really is. It's very important.
Yep.
And I did hate to be the one that had to sell it, but I had no choice. And government wants their money. You know, they want their inheritance taxes. And Daddy did not believe in, just like a lot of old timers do, these limited liability things, being a partner with anybody. He didn't believe that. It's mine, it's mine. Well, that could have saved him
Sure.
big bucks taxes, you know, but he didn't do it. That's all past.
Well, we've seen the county in your life and my life. We've seen our county go from a rural logging, some cotton a long time ago, ranching, to now this county has almost 450,000
Well, the
people.
last step is antiques, you know, for a little town.
That's right.
Everything converts to antiques, and that's about what Montgomery has. But it's coming back around now.
That's right.
There's some things going on that are going to happen in Montgomery.
That's right. Well, it's still the small town that you and I knew in many, many ways. It's just expanding around it.
It is. I just don't know the people like I used to. I had well, you're a good example of that, but I had a kid come. They have a historical thing. They're seventh graders in Montgomery. And we lived in town when we lived at that old parsonage. They come up and they read the historical plaque on the house. And I happened to hear some people on the porch, so I went around and, you know, can I help you? And they, no, sir, we're just reading the plaque. And I walked up and sat down on the porch watching them, and their mother was parked outside the fence waiting on them. There's kids in a car, two of them, I think. And he said, how long have you been in Montgomery? And I said, well, son, I was born in this town, as a matter of fact. And he turned around to his mother and said, hey, Mama, we found an old timer. So I've never really thought of myself as an old timer, but I'm it now.
That's right.
I guess I think about Montgomery and try to think of somebody that's, well, age. They're just not there anymore. They're gone. And
That's right. Now, you mentioned the name Nat Davis.
Nat Hart Davis, yeah.
He was part of the house.
Nat Davis.
Was he not a judge?
He was, yes. Nat Hart Davis. And then little Nat Davis was county judge in Montgomery here, his son. His father's one that was the judge, the circuit judge.
Okay.
They built that big home in Montgomery over there, which is now, they call it the Oaks. Also, he had that house down at where the old museum is there on 149, just as you turn off 105.
Okay.
They made a museum out of it. He was my great-grandmother's father. So he was makes him my great-great-grandfather.
Right.
But that's going back years and a few years back. But the house that my daughter lives in was built in 1887. And that picture I showed you has she and Billy Woods are in it.
Yeah, yeah. I guess
Pictures.
one of the things we didn't mention for the viewers is Montgomery's one of its legacies is the flag.
Yes, it is. Charles B. Stewart is one of the legacies of Montgomery too. But supposedly the flag was designed in Montgomery.
State flag.
Right, state flag, but he didn't actually live in Montgomery, so I'm not sure how that came about.
But we've sure laid claim to it, haven't we?
Yeah, well, so does the county. You know, they jump on it real quick.
That's right.
But that's fine. Just, you know.
Bob, is there anything else as you sit here and think that you forgot about?
Well,
I knew you weren't in World War II, so we won't talk about that.
no, I'm not. Wasn't a war person. Got around all of those.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Just the town has changed and will change and will continue to change. My children will see more changes than I've seen.
Right. Right.
We have several places to eat now. Grandma would enjoy that.
That's right.
I know she would.
That's right.
We didn't have Little League, and my grandchildren are enjoying that.
Yeah. I've said time and time again, I think that our generation was truly blessed to be living and have been raised in Montgomery County. Life was a little easier when you and I were young men, but people still come here to live.
What age did you start driving a car?
Probably 15, I guess.
Daddy taught me how to drive when I was 13 years old on an 8N tractor. On a tractor. And he had an old Poppin' Johnny I'd driven, but you couldn't shift a Johnny on the go like an 8N. You can, like you do a car with a clutch.
Right.
And so he taught me how to shift and go into high gear on that. Didn't have any automatic transmission. And when I was 15, I was driving a Jeep all over, out in the pastures, wherever you wanted to go. You couldn't do that today. You can't do it. The law would be after you start with. I remember Daddy having a Hudson. Don't ask me how, but there was a guy he fox hunted with. I know how. Talked him into buying a Hudson. He bought Chevrolets from Weisinger Chevrolet all his life. Man came home with a pacemaker Hudson, biggest, ugliest car in the world. But he loved it. And then drove it about 2 years and threw a rod out of it. Gave it to my sister. He got it fixed and gave it to my sister. And all they did was weld a patch on the side of the motor, put it back together. And she drove it about 2 years. I was 15 or 16 then. She gave it to me. So, and it would start burning up oil and all this. I drove it for a year or two. I didn't want to drive it out of the parking lot. The ugliest thing in the world.
They were big cars.
Big, ugly car. I mean, that was embarrassing to go somewhere in that. But Daddy was a good man. My dad was. He had friends. He remembered names better than anyone I've ever met. And he not only your name, your history, but he'd ask you about it when he met you. Where are you from? Who's your mama? I mean, he'd ask young people, who's your mama? Who's your daddy? And he would remember it. And telephone numbers. My goodness. He could spout telephone numbers by the hundreds. Just give him a name. He'd spout you a telephone number.
Of course, in one time, there was only 3 numbers.
Well, that's true.
Then it went to dial, you had to remember 6 numbers.
Well, he can remember the 6.
Good.
Yeah, I remember Miss Curry hanging on the wall. Had one telephone in one room in the house. Now you have 6 or 7.
That's true. That's true.
One phone. I called her up. I think I told you that story. Looking for Billy Woods. And Billy grew up. He was raised there in Montgomery too. So Miss Curry called Billy Baker for me. Bob, I think I saw him down at Craig's service station. Let me ring down there. That's when she was. Yeah, she was sitting on that porch and she could see Craig's down there. And she saw him on his bicycle down there. So she rang down there for me.
That's right. Well, that era of life may still go on in other parts of Texas, but obviously, civilization's caught up with Montgomery County, and because of the lake, because of our proximity to the airport,
right.
We're 50 miles from downtown Houston. We've been very fortunate to prosper.
Well, like I say, the little town is changing. You've seen the change. Conroe's changed, Lord. It's spread out so much. It used to be, come into Conroe where it's a Chase Bank out here on 105 going towards Montgomery. Before you get to Home Depot, really, across the road there. That was outside town. There was a little a motel there, that area right there. I can't think of the name of it. But that was, I could drive from Montgomery to Conroe and see one light on the side of the road, one light. And it'd be when you cross the river, on this side of the river there was a beer joint. You'd see light, maybe 2 or 3 at that beer joint. And come on into Conroe.
On the east side of the river?
Yes, east side of the river.
There was no beer joints in Montgomery?
No, Montgomery was dry.
Okay.
They changed all that, but it's dry back then.
That's right.
You couldn't get anything to drink. Oh, it was available, but Mr. Craig used to sell it.
Illegally.
Oh, it was a little clearer in color, but he'd sell it.
So there were some stills in Montgomery?
No, there were several of those around.
They brew their own whiskey.
Real quick. Buster Bailey was a black man that lived there. Buster made whiskey and sold it. Had a nub hand.
We looked at a picture earlier. There used to be a college in Montgomery.
Well, they called it the Academy.
The Academy?
Yeah.
What was that?
It was a school. It was actually their school in the town of Montgomery. It took all grades. And it's set up in the middle of the highway, as I told you, 105 and 149. It set right in the middle of the road there. Of course, the road wasn't there. That wasn't the highway then.
That's right.
The road went before you get that bear, we would bear off to the right, which is now John Butler Drive or something. And then it would go by the old Davis Cottage, go up in front of the Baptist Church and turn back left and then turn right again. That was changed some time back. Then when they widened it, like I told you, they cut down that old boardock tree. But they had, when they straightened that road out, and it was a crooked road coming through town there, they had to take that tree out. Rock Raven had a Conoco service station there, and he had an ice house, and he kept watermelons in it. Well, you know, kids, you got to get in and find a watermelon, and you didn't always have a quarter in your pocket. Oh, that's something else we had in town. We had a movie theater. We had a tent show.
A tent movie theater?
It would come to town about once every 6 weeks, and it'd stay about a week. Yeah. And you paid, I think, a dime to get in. Popcorn balls were a nickel. They'd have, what do you call the stuff you pour in to mix a drink with?
Syrup?
No, it was, it comes in granular form. Can't think what they call that stuff now. Anyway, you could buy a drink of that, they'd give it to you in a paper cup. And they'd show movies and then series movies. Have 6 or 7, you know, Hugh Gibson, the Sheriff's Daughter and things like that. You'd always see him right off a cliff at the end of it. You had to come back next week and find out what happened to him. And about 16 different comedies were on it. So
it was shown in a tent?
Do what?
That movie was shown in a tent?
Yeah, it was a tent show, big tent show. I took my dog in there with me. I had a little dog named Joe Boy. I'd walk down the hill. You know, that was a kid, 9, 10 years old. You weren't afraid of going around town.
That's right.
You walk out in town, and you knew half the people there. Take my dog in, lay down, dog. He'd lay down there on the bench.
Watch the movie with you.
That's right. Get him up and walk home.
Interesting.
But that's when they rode horses all over town, too.
Mr. Peel, we conclude these discussions. We ask people like yourselves with a lot of history, knowing that the people 1 year, 3 years, 5 years will be looking at this. You have anything you want to say to future generations about what it was like, what they can look forward to, any comments for the future?
Well, just basically, I hope they never have to live through a drought that we're going through right now.
That's good.
Because cattle people are suffering.
Yeah.
They're really suffering. I see them every day, and my son is going down to Louisiana buying his $100 rolls of hay, and that gets expensive. Actually, he even went to Mississippi and got some. And it gets expensive, so I hope we don't have to experience that again, because it hurts people, hurts everybody.
The local paper made a comment. One people said, we pray for rain. The other people said, no, we pray for hay.
Well, one comes the other, though.
That's right. And we don't want it to rain to fall from the sky. I'd like to see hay fall from the sky.
But every generation's got to make their own town. Daddy and his generation, they did it one way. And after him, it was done another way. So any advice you give to the next generation, I don't think they're going to heed it to start with. They're going to do what they want to do and what they think is right. And I think that's the way it should be, being honest with you.
Okay.
Politics are a funny thing. But
well, as we discussed yesterday with Dr. Wilkerson, you know, we've gone from being 100% Democratic to now we're 100% Republican.
He was a big key in that.
That's right. That's right.
And you have a lot of Democrats that are now Republicans.
Oh.
You didn't always change. I didn't grow up a Republican. I grew up a Democrat too.
I always wondered how somebody in office could say, well, I'm this 1 year, and now I decided to be that.
Well, then you went through that transition period. You were an independent. So. I vote for the person. That's a favorite saying. Okay. That's like somebody going gambling and losing. You ask them, well, how'd you do? Well, we had a good time.
That's right.
You know, they lost their behind on that.
Okay. Mr. Peel, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. It's been my pleasure.
Glad that you were willing to come in today and share your history of Montgomery County.
Well, I hope I could contribute something. I'm not sure I do.